congratulations to Debbie, and and talk with one another in the chat. I'm going to ask Alexis now to let us know how we can actually get hold of this book. We have a link to where you can get the book, as well as a special discount code that you can use. All right. So now I'm going to turn it over to Debbie. Debbie, take it away.
Thank you. And I'm going to share my screen and do the slideshow. And hopefully that will work. And it has. So thank you very much. And quickly, I was looking at who's on this webinar. I recognize many friends from CWA, some who will taught me a lot about what I'm going to be talking about. I noted that one of my professors is on and some of my other colleagues. So, and Pat, you would probably recognize some of the names because I retired 5 years ago. And so I'm not sure of all of the CWA folks, but welcome, welcome. I'm going to talk about this book that I wrote after spending almost 30 years in the CWA research department, where one of my assignments was to support the customer service segment of our union. And when I retired, I then had time to write this first as a PhD dissertation and then transform it into a book. And isn't it a beautiful cover? I love the cover. The book is a history, a labor history, focused on the changes in working conditions and what that meant for people who were customer service reps in the telephone companies. And you see on the left, which is where my book begins, in the years late 1960s, early 1970s, then they were called the business office, what the business office looked like in a telephone company. And I want to start by pointing out an anomaly in that picture. It's an Illinois Bell service rep around 1970. You see that the service rep is an African-American male. Now, that was very rare. Most service reps in that period were women. There were African-Americans, and there were Latinos in the Southwest where there was a larger Latino or Hispanic population. But the reason I saw this picture, and it's the only picture I could find of what the business office looked like in the days of the paper records. The reason I found it, it's in the National Archives, and it was put into the record of an affirmative action suit that was filed by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission against the Bell system, the monopoly telephone system that had 1 million employees. And they thought, when the EEOC filed the suit, they thought it was going to be about race. But it turned out it was primarily about gender, because the largest group of workers at that point were the operators. There were 250,000 operators, 5 were men. There were about 250,000 technicians, 5 were women. And in the customer service job, they were almost all women. The EEOC and AT&T reached a consent decree in 1972, and then you began to see more men in the job. But Illinois Bell put this picture in the record to try to show that indeed they were more diverse than they really were. But for my purposes, what I want you to see in that picture, at that point, all records were paper records. And this service rep, if you were a customer and called in, you would first go to your call would go to the person who had your exchanges, those first 3 numbers, which you can see on that chart there. There are numbers there. He was responsible for those customers. And only if he was busy and you called in and you were in his exchange, somebody else would pick up the phone, walk over, get the paper records from what was called a tub, it looks like a filing cabinet, and bring them back to their desk and address whatever the reason the customer was calling. People got up 30, 40 times a day. They had a chance to chat. The offices were small. They knew their local area. That's what life was like in the paper record period. Now on the right, you see the change. That's a Verizon consultant. They changed the name at Verizon from service rep to consultant. I happened to be visiting that call center, and I took this picture. It looks like a pleasant place to work, right? She's sitting there, but she's got her headsets on. Calls are dropping in one after the other. She's tied to her desk. She only gets up for her 15-minute breaks twice a day that were negotiated by the union and for her lunch hour. Otherwise, and you see the cubicles there, the workers are separated. At that point, this was in a big warehouse-sized room, and the glass panel behind there, that's the office of the supervisor, who either could be watching her or listening into her phone calls. That's the change. And what did this mean for workers and for the workplace? That's what my book, Disconnected, addresses. Now, why is this book about the changes in the customer service operation relevant as we think about labor struggles today? It tells the story of how CWA, the union, responded to major technological disruption. Now, clearly, right now, we're going through another period of major change as AI is entering into artificial intelligence into workplaces. How did the union, CWA always had to respond to technological change in the phone industry, and from early on took the position that the union had to have a role, and we couldn't block technological change. So how could we have a role that would make this work better for workers? We were able to negotiate some provisions, but in the United States, unions do not have a major role in how work is organized. And so it was always a challenge. Disconnected describes how changes in the ideology, politics, and the nature of capitalism impact changes in corporate policy, union strike, and conditions in the workplace. And one of the things I really worked hard in this book to do is to show how the regulatory changes and the changes in the nature of capitalism were felt by the frontline workforce, and what impact did that have on in this case, an organized workforce. What impact did it have on their power and their ability to negotiate good wages, benefits, and working conditions? The book really spans a major change in the nature of capitalism and our political economy, going from the regulated monopoly telephone company that was organized. Almost all non-management employees were in a union, either the CWA or the IBEW or an independent union, most in CWA. And this was part of what historians call the New Deal order coming out of the 1930s. But in the late 1970s, 1980s, as a result of other changes taking place in the economy and the politics, a blind faith in the market as the sole force for guiding our economic activity, stimulating innovation, and in theory, lower prices and quality. If you just leave it to the market and deregulate, it's going to spur innovation and benefits for consumers. And historians call this the change to a neoliberal order. And that is the span that I discuss in the book. Disconnected demonstrates within those changes how CWA leaders mobilized members to fight for good, humane, secure jobs. And in the process, the service reps who had a higher position in the company than the operators, who were mostly the entry-level jobs, how they became a workforce of resistance. And my quote here is from Karl Marx, that of course people can make their own history, but within the context in which they inherit a certain history and culture. So what was the impact of these changes? Look at this chart. The first line shows the number of communications or telecommunication workers. And you can see while there was a spike in the mid-2000s, that was the dot-com era, when people were had to get a second line because we didn't yet have broadband. And so they needed a second line for their dial-up. But you can still see that telecom, it's not steel or auto and the deindustrialized. Telecom is a dynamic industry. But as competition was brought into the industry, not just by Republicans, but by Democrats as well, that the competitive companies were all non-union. And you can see the decline, therefore, in the percent of union workers. Used to be back in the before the breakup of the Bell system that you had about 60% of the company was union, which means virtually anyone who's in an occupational job. Now it's down to about 16%. Now, how was the customer service rep viewed by the company? This was an ad that I found that AT&T placed in the pre-divestiture, pre-breakup era, 1969. If we were an airline, she'd be our stewardess, it says. She is the telephone company, at least to most customers she is. When someone wants a special service, an extra phone, or if there's a billing problem, this is the girl. Note they say girl. They were very paternalistic. They talk to. Her job is to help them. That's why she sits at a desk, her own desk, and why she doesn't have to type or take shorthand. It's a lot easier to be helpful when you're working under good working conditions. That was what it was like in the era of the monopoly telephone company. 1984, you have the breakup of the Bell system. AT&T becomes a long-distance company, so don't think about the AT&T you know today. It was just a long-distance company, and the local service was provided by 6 regional Bell operating companies. My book compares and contrasts what was going on at AT&T and at the local Bells, because competition came a little bit later to the local Bells. This is a chart that shows what happened at AT&T. AT&T was now facing intense competition from 2 anti-union, non-union companies, MCI and Sprint. They were long-distance startups. And the regulators were favoring those companies. They wanted to introduce, they'd given up, in a sense, on regulation. They wanted to introduce competition. And so those new companies had lower rates, actually, than the unionized AT&T. So AT&T came to the union and said, we are going to have to create from scratch, greenfield, new call centers, because we used to not provide customer service to residential customers. That used to be provided by the local Bell company. We're going to have to open new centers. They're going to be modern. They're going to have a nationwide call queue. And we think we'll have to hire about 13,000 people. We have 2 ways to go. Either you can agree to a 10% wage cut, because then we can think we can compete with MCI and Sprint, or we're going to outsource this. And you know who they were going to outsource it to? American Airlines, because American Airlines had the most advanced database software system. If you were a union leader, what would you do? This is not unique. The idea of, are we going to create, I don't know if you'd call it a second tier, because there wasn't a first tier at AT&T, but it was second tier compared to if you were a service rep, like my friend Pat Telesco at a local company. And you can see the union chose to accept that because they figured we'll be able to bargain up the wage. But if we don't have them in the union, we won't have any power to represent them. But you can see by the red line that the AT&T account rep by the year 2000, their annual earnings were about 10,000 less than if you were a service rep at Bell Atlantic or one of the local companies. That's one of the things that competition meant to the workers, a downward pressure on wages. Now at Bell Atlantic, the company could not do that because there were already people working this job, and the union represented 2/3 of the company. It was very strong. And so instead, what Bell Atlantic did, and this is a way to describe really what it was like to be a service rep in this competitive era, is they implemented speed up and sales quotas. And this is 1986, a letter that was written by a woman named Judy Buchanan to the CWA Bargaining Committee. She said, "Never in my 18 years have I been subjected to the pressure, tension that is now in the job that I'm facing in the last 2 years. The company," I can't read it because my picture is over it. "The company has but one thought in mind, and that is to ball and chain the once flexible service rep to the black box on her desk. They're now putting screens around our desk to isolate us from each other, so our full concentration is centered entirely on sell, sell, sell. Her job has grown by leaps and bounds, and the stress and tension have grown in proportion. Absenteeism is up. Nerve-related problems plague our workers. Morale is at an all-time low." So that's the life of the service rep as new technology was brought in. The new digital technology allowed the employer to track how many calls were coming in down to the minute, and they could track how many people they needed to meet that exact demand. And so they squeezed out any downtime. Now, this must sound familiar as you read about what's happening in other workplaces. And they could surveil to make sure, and they could record and listen to the conversations and use that to increase the pressure on the service reps. And here is a new term that the union leaders began to hear about from the reps: adherence. What is adherence? Once you've squeezed out any downtime, then it's absolutely critical from a management point of view that your workers adhere to the schedule they're given. If you're supposed to take your break at 10:30, you better take it. And if you have 15 minutes, you better be back by 10:45. Well, to the service reps, adherence was sticking it to the worker. Why? Let's say you were on a call with a customer and your break came at 10:30, but you wanted to, your whole culture is to help the customer. You stay on the line till 10:35. You're out of adherence. You take your 15-minute break. That's in the union contract. You come back at 10:35 and 15 minutes. You come back and you're out of adherence again. So the union leaders began to hear from the reps what this was. And the reps began to demand that the union do something. And so the union launched a nationwide mobilization against this strict enforcement and discipline around adherence. And here you see one of the flyers. The person says, "I'm sorry, sir, but due to adherence, monitoring, the surveillance, and sales quotas, I have no time in my daily schedule to help you." Think about what that means to the employee whose whole identity and sense of satisfaction at work is being eliminated by this adherence. I love this one. This was a local in Ohio. They put together a comic book. "Now I can't make you wear these," and he's holding catheters, but it sure would help with adherence. In 97, CWA took a stress survey of our members. Well, not scientific or anything. The numbers were astounding. 2/3 reported stress-related illness. A third were taking time off due to those illnesses. And they were telling the union call centers had become the electronic sweatshop, kindergarten, workplace from hell. Now, my book goes on, and I'm not going to spend time here, but goes on to talk about some of the bargaining initiatives to curb the unreasonable sales quotas, to curb adherence, to curb the monitoring. And there was a lot of progress made at the bargaining table, but every time we would come up with something, the employer would figure out, try and have a workaround. What I am going to talk a little bit about is the organizing. And I know one of our organizing directors is on the call right now, and I want to call her out for all of her great work. CWA at this point recognized, and every union has to do this. You don't just look at what your members are doing. You have to look into the future. And if you're in communications, that means that the technology is changing. So in the in the 1990s, the majority of our members still worked delivering local telephone service, wireline telephone service. But we knew wireless was growing and the internet was growing, and that was the future. So we needed to negotiate jurisdiction over that work. The companies put the wireless in a different subsidiary, and they said these are non-union. Down in Southwestern Bell, our leadership there launched an aggressive, creative program to get to organize the wireless workers. And they used the power that we had on the telephone side at the bargaining table to leverage power to reach out to the wireless workers and to get the company, after 5 years, you see the title of the brochure, 5 years for the company eventually to agree that it would be neutral and it would allow for majority sign-up representation. It took 5 years and a long struggle. And part of what allowed the CWA to have that kind of leverage was it was a moment of enormous corporate change. And whenever you have a company that is in the midst of a transaction, that's a point of leverage. Here, after 1996, Congress passed the Telecommunications Act, and local companies began to buy each other up. Southwestern Bell wanted to buy Pacific Bell. And in order to get that through the very tough California Public Utility Commission, they knew they needed CWA support. And our quid pro quo was, if you're going to grow, company, the union has to grow. This is in contrast to, and I won't take too long on it, but I have a whole chapter in the book, contrasting organizing once the employer has agreed to be neutral with an aggressive employer that is determined to do whatever they can to keep the union out. And that was what Sprint did. And eventually they closed centers and sent the message to their workers that if you're going to organize, that means your choice is not a union or no union. Your choice is a union or a job. So here's what neutrality means. CWA won the card check agreement with SBC in 1998, and you can see this line going up every time there was a merger. The SBC would agree that when they bought Pacific Bell, SNET, where Pat comes from in Connecticut, Ameritech in the Midwest, Bell South, and eventually AT&T, and renamed itself AT&T. All of this would extend to the workforce. So CWA was able to reach out to the workers without employer opposition. At one point, representing 45,000 employees. But the outsourcing since then has dropped the numbers. And Pat told me a few minutes ago that it's even lower than 31,000. I'm going to conclude, and my book concludes on a high note. Unfortunately, the high note did not last past the year 2000, but this is the high note. All of the stress that I've talked to you about, at the same time, the majority women workforce. We're educating the CWA leaders, the bargainers, who were mostly men and who mostly came out of the technician side of the house and did not understand the kind of stress that was the life of the service rep at the call center, because they had a lot more freedom. Of course, now they have GPS that follows them, but at that point, they had a lot of freedom. So by the year 2000, CWA had the women activists had educated the men who were bargaining about the issues, and they demanded, we want that to have relief at the call centers. The year 2000, CWA went on strike against Verizon. This was a very opportune moment, because at that point, still wireline telephone was the major source means of communication. We represented from what this at the same time, Bell Atlantic had just merged with another company, GTE, and renamed itself Verizon. And they were rolling out their new brand name. And at that time, we represented people from Maine to Virginia and West Virginia. 67,000 employees went on strike for three things: job security, organizing rights at Verizon Wireless, and stress relief in the call centers. And this, from the New York Times, shows how this became an issue that resonated with the public. When may I help you is a labor issue. And CWA won that strike, got this job security, got actually the organizing rights of Verizon Wireless, but Verizon never abided by them, never planned to abide by them. And that still is an anti-union company. We only represent a small number there. And then the book goes on to talk in an epilogue about what's happened since, but this was the high water mark. So I've given you a little bit of an overview. I could have told lots more stories, and I'm sure I've gone over my allotted time, but I encourage you, if I've teased you with interest, you can get the book from the University of Illinois Press. Just type it into Google and it'll lead you. And then when you get to the press, you can just type in the search disconnected and use this F24 UIP code, and you get a 30% discount. It's really a reasonable price. And I look forward to questions. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you, Debbie. And Alexis, maybe you could drop that information on how to get the book one more time into the chat for folks. We all certainly look forward to reading more. Let's hear a little bit from Pat. So Pat works closely with the current reps who do this work the way it's done today. And there have been a lot of changes in recent years with the pandemic and with technology. So Pat, I wonder if you could say a little bit about what are the big issues for call reps today, and how do they build power in this new context?
Thanks, Lane. And, I have to say that when I read Disconnected, it resonated deeply with me because I was a service rep through the 80s, through the 90s, through all of those developments. And, it rings true today. You hate to say it, history repeats itself. The stress is there, it's building. CWA negotiated a lot of protections for reps over the years, but right now, I would say the two game changers are work from home, which came about after the pandemic, and artificial intelligence and other systems being used to ramp up the surveillance and the monitoring to work around things we negotiate. So I just want to say that during the pandemic, workers found they like to work from home. AT&T right now, I would say almost the majority of reps are working from home. And, they still have some centers, but CWA negotiated temporary work from home agreements during the pandemic when the centers had to close and we all had to stay home. CWA negotiated temporary ones and then again extended them. And then in the 22 contract bargaining, it was clear that the work from home was here to stay. The members liked it. CWA negotiated work from home rules. What kind of rules? Well, protections for, being surveilled, the web cameras, not being used for surveillance. A way to communicate with their fellow reps via getting union news on electronic links. And then getting reimbursed for internet, things like this. I think that how are we dealing with the work from home as a union? We had to pivot to electronic dues cards, which was done, and it went very well. We have union time during virtual orientations where the employers will put up a link to an electronic dues card. And then we as a union need to conduct meetings virtually as well to connect these folks. I tell Debbie, one of the groups I work with calls it building a village. And I love that because we're connecting work from home reps with each other. And when we show reps that there's others like them and they have a way to improve their circumstances at work, it's doable. Like I said, it's hard, but we can't resist change. And some locals have reported back that once we began holding the union meetings virtually or having hybrid meetings, the number of call center workers went up. And Debbie pointed out that they were mostly women, and there are a lot of men in these call center jobs now, but I believe it's still mostly women. And I think that's why work from home appeals so much to folks. But the fact that they're attending these meetings virtually from home, it shows, they just couldn't come to the actual meeting, but they want to be interested in what's going on in their union and what's going on at the local level. So we have to keep them connected like that. The other thing I wanted to say about AI was, wow, everything in Debbie's book just called something different, basically. It just intensifies the way that employers have used automated technology. And while we as a union, we bargain limits on the use of this, it's still a very stressful situation. For example, the AI software, it listens to the interaction. I've actually had a representative tell me a window popped up because the customer was crying and it was telling her to skip the next step, which was a product offer, which, surprised the rep. And I think that, these companies are changing and trying out different software to see what they like, but they're all using it. And another example is a rep being threatened with discipline if they don't go to the bot in the system to get support or look for a question. And the rep kept going to their supervisor. Well, they're trying to train reps not to do that, to go into the system and get the feedback on what kind of support they need. So the human touch in getting support is not there. So they've lost that. They're losing their autonomy. They have to speed up. Sound familiar? Just heard Debbie say all this. And stress increases from having less control of your work. So for example, I had a rep complain about the system putting incorrect notations in. As you're talking, the system is entering on the customer's account what supposedly is being said more often than not incorrectly. And then the rep is fed another call before they can take steps to correct these notes. And do they let it happen? They let it happen, yes, because they would be out of adherence if they didn't. So we have to be vigilant about all the same things our brothers and sisters took care of in previous years is coming back. The good thing is we have to use different tools to do it, but if we follow the same steps, we can achieve success. So
thank you. So, every year we hear the union membership numbers come out, and they every year tend to be worse and worse and worse. And yet, workers, there's been this uptick of interest in unions. We've seen, especially among young workers, we've seen lots of organizing and strikes. So I wonder if you can tell us just a little bit about what's happening with workers in this industry in terms of building power. What are some of the recent successes with your union, and what are workers doing in order to build power now?
I'm going to talk about one particular initiative that's been very interesting with CWA. CWA began to get a lot of phone calls from people who worked in the gaming industry, particularly quality assurance people, but also the developers of the games. And they were saying, oh my gosh, it is so stressful. when they're going to release a game, we have to work 24/7 and we have no protections and we have no job security. Can you help us? So CWA took an approach that we've taken it with a lot of other new areas where at first there's a lot of workers. You're not going to be able to organize one work site by one work site, and formed an organization called Code, which was something with digital workers. Well, lo and behold, Microsoft decides that they're going to buy Activision, which is a huge gaming company. And CWA had represented some smaller units of Activision, and Activision was viciously anti-union. Microsoft goes up to Capitol Hill. This is in the Biden administration when you have some antitrust enforcement. And Microsoft begins to hear that it's going to be tough to get that merger through because the tough antitrust regulators, the Department of Justice, are going to see some problems. And so they here on Capitol Hill, have you talked to CWA yet? What? You better talk to CWA. So Microsoft goes to talk to CWA and they're told, if you're going to grow, what's important for us is that we be able to represent the workers. And we know what's been going on in Activision. There has to be a change in attitude. You have to be neutral. Microsoft agrees we will be neutral, not only at this new acquisition of Activision game company, but any Microsoft workplace. And do you know they've abided by it? And CWA now represents thousands of people at various gaming companies. Activision, ZeniMax, World of Warcraft, Sega, Blizzard, Tender Claws. Those are just a few that I noted. So the challenge here, though, is with all of this enthusiasm for unions, and a lot of people who are on this call, they could be telling these stories themselves. The challenge is, how do we get scale? The kind of scale that we were able to get in the 1930s and then actually in World War II. How do we get scale? And how do we adapt our labor laws for the kind of fissured, broken up, subcontracted, independent contractor, gig worker, whatever you want to call it, for this kind of economy? And, you know, so we do have to continue to represent folks and build power, but at the same time, we have to understand that ultimately we're going to have changes in our regulatory and legal structure so that we can really scale up.
Terrific. Thank you.
I know you agree with that, Lane. And I think you would probably add, and we need to have non-union but innovative mechanisms for workers to join together. And
Debbie, you've been
their
listening.
power.
You've been listening. That's great. Yes.
I have to tell this group, Lane and I started, I think we started our labor history program together. She finished years before I did. And she wrote a fabulous book, Knocking at Labor's Door. So if you have not read that and you're on this call, you need to read that book too.
Well, thanks for the shout out. And Debbie, you were still working full time, so you had a real excuse. I want to make sure we hear just a little bit more from Pat, because Pat, you're still in the trenches doing this work with the call reps, and so I wonder if you have thoughts based on your experience about, you know, where should workers and their unions go from here?
I gotta say, Lane, I think I could list a lot of problems and don't have the answers for all of them. But, you know, I will say this is that, again, the tools might have changed that we use, but we know what we need to do. We need to, you know, when I came into the union, we had the Talk to Two program, you know, and there'll be some people nodding about that, you know, and your message gets out exponentially. I really believe that that works too with these folks. And when I referenced building a village, you know, we have a group that is doing just that with, you know, we get these work from home representatives You get them to come to a local meeting, you get them to virtually, because many of these people, this may sound strange to us, but they are hired being told that they will never meet their employer representative in person. So they're not gonna likely want to meet us in person right away either, not right away anyway. So we did find that when we share, they get on a training class, about what about unions, and they come to the local, meeting virtually. They get the contact information for their fellow workers and they feel less isolated. And I think that that is key, is just to keep talking to these people. And they report back to us their issues. I work with the research department too at CWA. Shout out to Debbie, because I worked with her for all those years, and you visited me at SNET. And I work with the research department now and get a lot of feedback on the various systems. I think these employers are trying all sorts of ways to replace us in some ways, so we need to prepare ourselves for what we need to do to make ourselves more valuable, and also prevent stress. It's, the workers are so stressed out right now. And again, it's like, if you read Disconnected, you can make the correlation to what we need to do. It's we used to get together as reps after work and talk about our problems. Everything that you said, Debbie, rang true with me too at SNED. And you figure it out with solidarity and actions. That's how you do it. You're on mute, Wayne.
Yeah, of course I'm on mute. So, so now we'll turn to the Q&A, to the question and answers. You can use that icon at the bottom of the screen. We'll start with David Cecilia's question. Was there a moment when yet another technological change, the dramatic fall in the cost of international telephony, led to the vast outsourcing of call worker jobs?
Yes.
So, okay, Debbie, you want to speak to that?
Hey, David. David was my professor in business history, and he is a fabulous teacher and thinker. And he knows this industry. Yes, the decline in the cost of long distance calls certainly facilitated outsourcing, but outsourcing began, it really was a way to save labor costs. And it's interesting. When when AT&T was broken up, it established a subsidiary called Transtech. And the whole purpose of Transtech was stock owners, just regular people, would have to call up and say, whose stock do I have now? And Transtech would take those calls. That went on for a couple of years. And then people had figured it out. AT&T decided that it was then going to insource customer service through Transtech. They would get contracts from General Mills, from auto company, to do telemarketing and customer service. The people who worked there primarily were temps who went to a temp agency and were sent for campaigns to work at Transtech. Eventually, AT&T decided we're going to sell Transtech. And when they sold it to a company called Convergys. The deal was made. Convergys said that a certain amount of, not only were they buying this subsidiary, but a certain amount of customer service calls had to be handled by Convergys. And that was the origins of the outsourcing. Then Convergys grew and grew and became a huge outsourced call center company. Convergys then started to go over to India and, of course, have service reps go over there and train people. And they discovered that they could save, cut the costs by 90%. And they came to AT&T and they said, now, why don't you start using the offshore call centers, which AT&T saw the numbers. And as its own business was going down because it wasn't competing against, once the local companies were allowed into long distance and its business was going down, began to send a lot of the calls to these overseas call centers. So yes, it was a matter of the cost of long distance going down, but it was primarily a response to how do we deliver services as cheap as we can. And the irony, and I assume everybody who's listening is saying, why don't these companies understand that what they say, we care about quality service, really does make a difference? We are so frustrated with the customer service now in this country. I don't care what company it is. Why don't they understand that good customer service is a competitive advantage? And they will tell their, you'll when you pick up the phone and you're on dial 1 for this and dial 2, they'll say, we care about our customers. We care about giving you good service, but they don't. It's a race to the bottom right now. And the only bulwark is the union. The only bulwark, because unfortunately, and the CWA always wanted to align with the consumer organizations, but they had bought into competition and they believed that lower prices was the way you were going to judge this. And lower prices doesn't always mean good service.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question from Anonymous who says, I appreciate the details you compiled on the history of bargaining and organizing changes in your book. You spend a little time on the issues of white male domination of CWA and the arc of trying to change that. What is the most important learning you would share from all that history? Share power and diversify leadership. And they suggest that maybe you should write an article just on that.
Do you want to address that, Pat? You're on mute.
No, I thought you were about to answer it, because you mentioned this in your book about women getting together and building a movement.
The women, it takes time. The women in CWA, the operators were critical to the founding of the union back in 1947. And the operators were critical. And at one point, they had a lot of power. If you went on strike and operators had to transfer calls, they had a lot of power. Well, with automatic dialing, that went away. And with the voice recognition and other changes, operators began to go away. But the operators back in the 1960s began to organize their own conferences. And they'd get together and they talk about their issues and they talk about how do we make these male bargainers understand? Because I skipped a point. The operator locals merged with the technician locals in the 1950s and 60s. And who became the president? The technician. The woman became the secretary treasurer. So they needed to build power back up, and the service reps too. Now, you see in our labor movement, finally, women and people of color are rising to top leadership. CWA's president, Claude Cummings, is African-American. He talks about that he part of why he was able to get his father was a janitor for Southwestern Bell. They wouldn't hire Black people as technicians. After the affirmative action decree, he was hired as a technician. And he rose, and now he's president of the union. Amina Salam is our secretary treasurer, African-American. She was a service rep. So you need to build power. It's not easy, but it's important. And of course, what's going on now with the reversal, I call anti-DEI, flat out racism and sexism. Let's call it what it is. And that's going to have impacts.
Thank you. We have a question for Pat. So if the supervisor is no longer helping the customer service rep, then what do they do?
Well, I believe the supervisors should be keeping their eyes wide open, because I don't think they have anything to do. these employers are not only taking, you know, the system as the supervisor, it's for everything. It's for scheduling, it's for reporting out. They do it all without ever speaking to the supervisor. So I do see the ratio of reps to supervisor increasing and less supervisors initially, anyway, from the AI taking their jobs. Yeah.
Okay. We have a question from Michael Childers, and they write, I think on the West Coast, operators were called the Hello Girls. Is that true?
It sounds familiar.
Okay, great. Any other questions from our group? Okay. Well, then, Debbie or Pat, do you have any final thoughts to leave us with?
No, the one final thought that I did have actually was a lot of listening to Debbie and the customer service. A lot of the customer service is changing to where customers do like to go online, do things themselves. And in those situations, they still need to sometimes chat with the rep. And we need to go after that work as well. That is kind of the new call center work too. It's a little offline chatting.
And we don't represent those folks?
We do, but it's becoming a bigger percentage of the
Mhm.
job. And I believe a lot of that work is outsourced still. You know, these companies would rather the first call, you know, the live calls come to their own people to leverage sales. To your point, Debbie, because that sell is still out there.
I think at this point, I guess my parting, we need to end every time we get together with people who share our values, our politics, and are concerned that working people have a voice, both at work and in the larger society. I think we always have to end not with a Pollyanna sense of hope, but with a sense that people coming together have made a difference. And I think that was the important message that I wanted in my book. People coming together at the workplace make a difference. But they make a difference within the structure of our political economy. So we've got to organize in the workplace, and we also really have to organize politically so that we have the kinds of laws and regulations that enable people to make a difference in their lives. And of course, that challenge is even greater in these years. But I think those of us who've been reading about the opposition, even in the Republican districts at these town halls, the movement against what Trump is doing is at its beginning, but it will grow because people are getting hurt.
Thank you. And I'll note that Cheryl Lianza had put a question in, what can we learn from today's moment? And I think, Debbie, you just answered that question.
Well, and we can also learn from Cheryl. Hi, Cheryl. She is such a fighter for good practices in the telecommunication industry. And we're lucky to have her taking important cases, including trying to save our universal service fund that provides subsidies to poor people for communications. And she's a lead in that. So Cheryl, while I don't see you on the screen, thank you for all you do.
Terrific. I think that brings our book talk and webinar today to an end. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Again, I encourage you to check out Labor Spring and check out events that are happening in your community. Thank you very much. And check out Debbie's book too.
And thank you, Lane, and thank you, the Kalmanovitz, and to our behind the scenes tech person, Alexis.
Yes. Okay. Thanks, everybody. That's
Bye-bye.
that's our end.